and I didn't feel like Kirsten Dunst was giving the right line reading. So I kind of took her to one side and gave her a note or two. And she looked at me like she didn't know who the hell I was. She had no idea that I'd actually written the book and that Simon Pegg was playing me and that she was based on the woman who went on to become my wife. And then within hours, the Evening Standard ran a kind of a splash saying, Theresa May's new university czar is porn addict. Yeah, I'd say that was probably one of the low points of my life was losing 5 jobs in very quick succession.
Right. So usually I don't do introductions for these, but I've just spent the last few hours learning about you and what you've got up to in your career, and it's so interesting. So I want to go through some of the things before we get into how you grew up and free speech stuff. So, and feel free to interject if I've got anything wrong. But you studied at Oxford, then your first job was with The Times, where you hacked the editor-in-chief's hacked into his account and had some fun with that.
Yeah, so they had this computer system, kind of like an intranet, and people would message each other all the time within the Times offices. And how much access you had to this network was dependent on your status. And I was a news trainee, so I had very little access. I was at the bottom of the food chain. And so every morning I would try and log in as the editor-in-chief, this guy called Charlie Wilson. And by trying to guess what his password was. And after 6 months, I suddenly hit on it. It was Top Man. I mean, I should have really got it sooner. So I then immediately sent a message to my rather supercilious, good-looking, dashing boss, who used to drive around in an open-top MG, and he would park his MG in the Times' car park. And my message to him said, "Move your effing car, it's in my space." And then it appeared on his screen seconds later, and underneath it had the editor, as though he'd just received that message from the editor, because I'd sent it, masquerading as the editor, because I'd got in. And he immediately leapt out of his chair and ran to the car park and got into his car and moved it. And I thought, wow, I can have a lot of fun here. So I sort of wreaked havoc for about a week, masquerading as the editor-in-chief. And then the sort of internal IT police kind of tracked me down. And I was summoned to the managing editor's office. And I thought, I was going to get a pat on the back. I mean, maybe a slap on the wrist, but I didn't think it was going to be any worse than that, because, these are the kind of skills that news reporters need these days. You need to be able to hack into a computer system and guess passwords and the rest of it. But actually, I was met by a security guard and handed the contents of my desk drawer in a see-through plastic bag and escorted from the premises. So that was my 6 months over at the Times.
Was his password actually Top Man?
His password was Top Man, yeah.
Wow. Okay, so then you went off to Harvard. You're a Fulbright scholar there for a year. And then you thought you might give academia a shot, so you started a PhD at Cambridge, at Trinity College. Yep. And then decided it wasn't for you. And then at some point you end up in New York working for Vanity Fair, and you end up writing a book. I think you end up being sacked there as well, right? And you end up writing a book called How to Lose Friends and Alienate People, which was made into a film. Like, I just found this out today. I'm like watching the trailer of this film with Simon Pegg, Megan Fox, Kirsten Dunst. Who's the main guy in it? Your boss.
My boss is played by Jeff Bridges.
Which is just like hilarious. Anyway, so, and it's interesting hearing about you. I heard a podcast where you're talking about why you think that wasn't necessarily commercially successful, and what, because it was kind of meant to be you as like the outsider, the Brit going up against this American establishment. Yeah, well,
the book, in the book, I try and pull off this sleight of hand whereby I kind of take the mickey out of myself. It's sort of a self-deprecating comic memoir, and it's about my misadventures, my failure to take Manhattan. And but I want the reader to conclude at the end that actually it's not me who is at fault, but the Manhattan media circus. So it was a sort of it was intended to be a kind of scabrous, satirical look at kind of the glossy magazine world in New York in the late 90s, seen through the lens of this kind of clownish kind of fool who keeps shooting himself in the foot. But the kind of more serious bit of that, the critique, didn't really find its way into the film. The film is just kind of has this kind of clownish character who's just a bit of a buffoon. I mean, it's fine. It's quite funny. But I think the reason they did it that way is because they ended up spending a fair whack for an English independent movie. And so they tried to model it on a Hollywood studio rom-com. So they really pulled out the kind of romantic story, which is a subplot. So I met my wife in Manhattan, and we ended up getting married.
Is that Kirsten Dunst's character?
That's the Kirsten Dunst character, yeah. But actually in real life she was English, not American. But they kind of foregrounded that subplot and tried to turn it into a commercial, studio-like romantic comedy, but without really the chops to know how to make a kind of mainstream, commercially successful romantic comedy. So it doesn't quite work. And I thought it would have been better, actually, if it had been made for much less money, but made with a kind of independent, kind of violently anti-American spirit. That would have been, in the end, I think, a much more entertaining film, but and potentially even much more successful. But what do I know? The producers probably knew what they were doing, and not every film is a hit.
How does it feel having a film made about you? Like, are you able to, because even the guy has the same surname as you, right?
Yeah, but they changed the first name to Sydney.
Are you able to separate yourself enough from it to just laugh at it, and it's like, yeah, this is something I wrote, but
yeah, well, it was a much, I expected it to be kind of a much more ego-inflating experience than it was, actually. So I got a taste of what it was going to be like when the director, a guy called Bob Whitey, he and Simon Pegg and I met together for the first time, and Simon had just made Hot Fuzz, and he'd really kind of got into shape to make Hot Fuzz. Like, he was really buff. He'd done a lot of work in the gym with a trainer, and he was like best condition he's ever been in. And Bob took one look at Simon and one look at me and said, "Simon, if you're going to play this guy, you're either going to have to gain 20 pounds, or we're going to have to put you in a fat suit." And I thought he was joking. I laughed. I thought he was just taking the mickey out of me. But then, sure enough, on the first day of principal photography, Simon had gained something like 50 pounds. And he was totally out of shape. He was like this schlub. So actually, the director meant it. And I remember I got thrown off the set in quite short order because I witnessed a scene with Kirsten Dunst and Simon Pegg. And I had a kind of hand in the script, even though I don't get a screenwriting credit. I get a co-producer credit. But some of the gags, some of the lines I'd written, and a lot of it was taken from the book in any event, and it was my life. So I kind of knew what was supposed to be happening, and I didn't feel like Kirsten Dunst was giving the right line reading on, in this particular scene. She didn't know where the gag was. She wasn't hitting the right word in the line reading, so I kind of took her to one side and gave her a note or two, and she looked at me like she didn't know who the hell I was. She had no idea that I'd actually written the book and that Simon Pegg was playing me, and that she was based on the woman who went on to become my wife. She just thought I was some crazy stalker guy who kind of crept onto the set and was now giving her notes on her performance, and it was horribly inappropriate. And after that, Bob Whitey said, "Toby, I think it'd be better if you don't come down to the set anymore." And so I, kicked off the set of my own movie almost within days of it beginning, and I was the co-producer.
There you go. Okay, but then you've done so much more since. So you end up writing for the Spectator. There's a whole series of sex scandals, including one of Boris Johnson's, and then you write a play called Who's the Daddy?
Yeah, co-authored with, so me and a guy called Lloyd Evans were sharing the drama critic beat at the Spectator when a succession of sex scandals engulfed the Spectator, and it briefly became known as the Sextator. They were incredible. Like, not only did Boris get the deputy editor pregnant, even though she wasn't his wife, but in addition, Rod Liddell, one of the Spectator's star columnists, left his wife on their honeymoon to return to England to continue his affair with the Spectator's 19-year-old receptionist. And in addition, Kimberly Fortier, the publisher of the Spectator, was having an illegitimate child with the blind Home Secretary of the country, David Blunkett. So these three scandals hit almost simultaneously. People were like, there must be something in the water over there. And me and Lloyd were kind of at lunch one day, we're thinking somebody's going to turn this into a fantastic, sex farce. It's just too good not to do. And then we thought, well, we've been reviewing plays now for several years. Why don't we have a go? And so we wrote this sex farce ourselves called Who's the Daddy? And it sold out almost immediately. It played to packed houses, admittedly above a pub in Islington, quite a small theatre. But we did have 3 offers to take it into the West End. But Boris he'd been really good about the whole thing, so he'd taken it on the chin. He sent us this postcard on press night saying, I always knew my life would be turned into a farce, and I'm just relieved it's been entrusted to 2 such distinguished men of letters. If there'd been a typeface called Irony, he would have used it. But he didn't sack us. He didn't try to punish us in any way. He took it on the chin. So when he then asked us not to take it into the West End, we found it quite difficult to say no. We thought, well, God, we've had such a success with this play. Let's just write another one. Take that one into the West End. And we did write another one, and that one was a total flop. And we didn't get any offers to take that into the West End. So I now bitterly regret being nice to Boris and not taking it into the West End. But anyway, so it goes.
And Boris you'd known for a long time, right? Because a magazine you started at Oxford, he then...
Well, a magazine someone else started, but I was, it was like the Private Eye, which is our, bi-weekly satirical magazine, a bit like Liberation in France. The Oxford equivalent was called Tributary, and I didn't start it, but I edited it, and then Boris took it over. Boris and Charles Althorpe, Princess Diana's brother, they took it over. And I think Darius Guppy, who was a great friend of Boris's and was subsequently jailed for fraud, but they took it over from me. But yeah, I knew Boris. We were exact contemporaries at Oxford, so we came up at the same time, and I knew of him before I met him for the first time because my uncle dated his mother at one point. So I sort of got to know him a bit at Oxford. We were never great friends, but minor friends.
Got it. Okay, and then some point after that, you co-found 4 schools, so free schools, which are taxpayer funded, but they're run by the parents.
Well, not in every case, but yeah, broadly speaking, they're taxpayer funded. So the entire cost is met by the state, but they have a bit more independence than most state-funded schools, and they're often set up by groups of parents or teachers or charities, so they can vary term times. For instance, they don't have to teach the national curriculum. They have a bit more latitude when it comes to hiring and firing of staff. And they can vary the length of the day. So they have a bit more autonomy than typical state schools. And it was a flagship education policy of the coalition government, which was in power from 2010 to 2015. And Michael Gove was the education secretary at the time. And I was worried about where my 4 kids were going to go to school. They were all at quite a good primary school, but the only good secondaries in my neighbourhood were either Catholic or Protestant. You had to be one or the other to get your kids in. I wasn't, so that was pretty hopeless. There were a couple of good secular schools, but they were so oversubscribed you practically had to live within the school gates to get your kid in. So we initially thought we're going to have to move to within the catchment area, a really good school. And we almost moved to Suffolk, which is where
in London?
We were living in London at the time. We almost moved to Suffolk, which is about 100 miles from London. And it's sort of in, rural England. Very different to Acton, where we were living at the time, or Shepherd's Bush. And we got quite far with that. And then I thought, I had a kind of, an epiphany. I sort of thought, why am I moving halfway across the country? Uprooting myself, saying goodbye to my community and my friends, just so my children can secure a good taxpayer-funded education. That should be something that's available to everyone in every neighbourhood. You shouldn't have to jump through all these hoops to secure something which should be the right of every citizen. So I got kind of angry. And that spurt of anger inspired me to write an article about wanting to set up a free school. And Michael Gove had already started talking about it. This was in 2009, so before the coalition government was created. I wrote an article about wanting to do it. I invited people to contact me if they were interested in doing it. About 50 people did. They all crowded into my front room. Out of that group, about 12 really committed people, most of them parents, emerged, and we formed a steering committee. And 2 years later, we opened the school, and it was one of the first free schools to open, one of 24 that opened that year, one of a handful of secondaries. Boris opened the school. He was then Mayor of London, came to cut the ribbon and said, the Secretary of State for Education has given a new word to the English language. He gave us this school. Quite funny at the time. And my kids all ended up going to the school, and the same group of people that had set up the secondary went on to set up 3 primaries, and it's now, I'm no longer involved, but it's now a growing multi-academy trust, and the secondary's done very well. It was in the Times's Best Schools Guide a few months ago, and I think we calculated it's in the top 5% of co-educational, state-funded, non-selective secondary schools in England. Maybe in England and Wales, actually, or even the whole country. But anyway, it's done pretty well, and something I'm very proud of having done.
And free refers to that it's non-fee paying, but it's also free from government interference.
Well, yeah, I think the original origin is that it was based on a Swedish policy, and in Sweden they're called free schools, but in America they're known as charter schools. They're very similar, similar idea, similar concept. They've been that idea of allowing groups, mainly of parents but not exclusively, to set up schools, which are then funded by the taxpayer if they can kind of meet certain tests, meet certain standards. That's been rolled out, across numerous countries, and it has a kind of mixed track record. I think the track record of free schools here has been very, very good. They are among the highest performing schools in the country, and probably the most interesting school, the most talked about school in the country, which is Michaela Community School, which Catherine Burble-Singh set up and is the head of. That's a free school.
Got it. Okay, and then since that, you were cancelled, which looked like Theresa May put you up for a role in education, and you kind of overnight lost 5 positions for something to do with being a porn addict or something being dug up. Yeah,
so I was properly cancelled in at the beginning of 2018. So I'd been appointed to the board of a new education regulator called the Office for Students, created by Theresa May's government. Within minutes of my appointment being announced, it was announced by the Department for Education at 1 minute after midnight on New Year's Day 2018, and The Guardian got it into their heads that the government were trying to kind of sneak out this bad news when everyone would be drunk on New Year's Eve, in the hope of avoiding any scrutiny. So The Guardian thought, well, we're not going to let them get away with that. So they kind of ran this big story on the front of their website. Theresa May's new university czar is Toby Young. which was a wild inflation. I mean, I was one of 15 non-execs on this board. I wasn't her university's czar by any stretch of the imagination, but then people decided, oh my God, we're not going to let her get away with this. He's not qualified to be her university's czar. So within minutes, I started trending on Twitter with people digging up all these reasons. All these offence archaeologists started trawling through everything I'd written, dating back in one case to 1987, to try and find evidence that I was an unsuitable person to be Theresa May's university's czar. And, because I'd been a provocative journalist and, had a pretty interesting career, it didn't take them long to find, a treasure trove of material. And one thing, as you just referred to, that was dug up. So I read a piece in the Spectator in 2001 in which I was arguing for a more liberal attitude towards sex in films by the British Board of Film Classification, sort of making the argument that more permissive censorship regimes in Scandinavian countries didn't lead to more sex crimes, and a standard kind of anti-censorship argument. But in the course of writing that piece, I relayed an anecdote in which Philip Larkin, our most treasured post-war poet, once wrote to Kingsley Amis, Martin Amis's father, also a great novelist, saying that he was loitering outside a sex shop in Soho when the owner of the shop came out and said, "Was it bondage, sir?" And as a matter of fact, yes, it was. And I referred to Larkin in what I thought was an affectionate way as a fellow porn addict, but it was a kind of self-deprecating throwaway line. But the sub-editor of the Spectator mischievously put at the top of the piece, "Confessions of a Porn Addict." So someone found that in the Spectator archives, and they took a screenshot of it, put it on Twitter, and then within hours, the Evening Standard ran a kind of a splash saying Theresa May's new university czar is porn addict. And then that was repeated the next day in the Times. As every self-deprecating thing I'd written about myself, dating back 30 years or more, was dredged up and used and taken at face value as a reason I wasn't a suitable person to serve on this august body. And initially Downing Street defended me, and then they decided that I wasn't worth defending, and it got quite ugly. So there was a petition demanding that Theresa May fire me. It got 220,000 signatures.
Led by who?
Who started the petition? I can't even remember. It was on change.org, and all these. An urgent question was asked about my appointment in the House of Commons, and these kind of po-faced Labour MPs lined up to denounce me, with like a pack of journalists parked on my doorstep day and night, kind of on resignation watch, after kind of 8 days of this, and it got to the point where my daughter didn't want to go to school, but she didn't want to run the gauntlet. My 14-year-old daughter didn't want to run the gauntlet of these reporters kind of barking questions at her. I thought, this is just absurd. I'll resign. I mean, it's not a paid job. It wasn't exactly a bauble. I wasn't going to be any kind of czar. I was going to be a foot soldier, a spear carrier. So I resigned. And I very foolishly apologised for some of the more sophomoric things I'd said on Twitter or in the past in the Spectator. Wished the Office for Students well, and thought, well, that'll draw a line under the whole affair and I'll just be able to carry on with my life. But actually, the outrage mob, having forced me to stand down from one position, then went after me in all my other positions. It was like throwing a hunk of raw flesh to a shoal of piranha fish. I mean, just embarked on a feeding frenzy, and I ended up having to stand down as a Fulbright Commissioner, as an honorary fellow of the University of Buckingham, as a trustee of the charity that I'd set up, that all these schools I'd helped set up sat within, and also I had to give up my day job as head of something called the New Schools Network, which was an education charity that helped other groups set up free schools. So I lost 5 positions in total, and so it was quite brutal. And after the kind of dust had settled and I'd had a bit of time to reflect on it all, I thought, well, what made it quite a brutal experience was the lack of any organisation to turn to for support. I really didn't know whether apologising would make things better or worse. I didn't know whether I should resign or fight attempts to kind of winkle me out of these various positions. Should I have gone as quietly and as willingly as I did, or should I have tried to cling on? I kept out of the media when it was all happening, on the advice of a couple of political friends, but maybe that wasn't the right thing to do. Maybe I should have been out there fighting my corner. It would have been great, I thought, if there'd been an organisation which could have given me a bit of moral support and given me some really good, disinterested professional advice. And also put me in touch with other people who this had happened to, so I could talk to them about it, form a support group, whatever. Offer me some psychological support as well. So you really do feel kind of isolated. And, in my case, most of my friends were pretty good, stood by me, but often people who find themselves targeted by outrage mobs, the hardest thing is immediately being deserted by their friends who just join the mob, join the witch hunt. It happens again and again, and people are continually surprised and shocked by it. So I thought, well, why don't I set up an organisation like that? I can't do anything more in education. I'm an untouchable as far as, getting involved in another education charity, trying to set up any more schools. That's never going to happen. That's not in my future. But maybe I can do this. I'll set up an organisation which offers people the services that I desperately needed but couldn't find anywhere when I was in the eye of that particular storm. So that was the sort of origin of the Free Speech Union.
And then you also set up Lockdown Skeptics, which I just realised today is how I first came to learn about you, because you spoke in a debate at the Cambridge Union when I was studying at Cambridge during lockdown.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so I was a lockdown skeptic, and I wrote a piece in The Critic, a conservative monthly, which was very critical of the lockdown policy, less than a week after we'd all been locked in our homes on May 23rd, 2020. So from a very March 2020. So from a very early stage, I thought it was a disastrous policy and would cause far more harm than it prevented, and couldn't believe that no one else could see that. So I wrote this very critical piece challenging the wisdom of the lockdown policy for The Critic, and immediately got piled on, on Twitter, other social media channels, people condemning me as putting people before profits, being a granny killer, being a typical Tory who didn't care about the people who would suffer and die as a consequence of letting the virus rip, all the usual calumny that was kind of poured onto the heads of anyone who was sceptical of the policy, at least in the beginning. And I thought, crikey, this is pretty intense. And lots of people contacted me to say, I feel exactly the same way, but I haven't been, I haven't dared say it to anyone. So I thought what I need to do is create a sort of community online for people who are sceptical about the lockdown policy and feel a bit isolated in their kind of families, in their communities, and feel unable to kind of express their skepticism for fear of all the vitriol they'll attract if they do. I need to create a kind of safe space for lockdown skeptics. So I set up this sort of news publishing site called Lockdown Skeptics, and ran it for the best part of 2 years. And then when Boris declared Freedom Day, which I think was, I get the dates right, it was like something like July 19th maybe, or maybe it was the 20th in 2021. So like 18 months after, a bit more than when we've been first locked down, a bit less, maybe 15 months after. We changed it to the Daily Sceptic, and we kind of pivoted from just being sceptical about the lockdown policy to also being sceptical about net zero and kind of woke gobbledygook in all its manifestations. So we call those three things the unholy trinity. And I've since set it up as a company and hired a full-time editor and a few other people as well. And it's become, to my astonishment, quite successful. It gets about 2 million page views a month, and we can't really attract advertising because we're rated so poorly by various advertising ratings agencies, all of which are kind of tools of the establishment and exist to try and prevent dissident, anti-establishment news publishing sites from attracting advertising. So they've quite successfully kind of cut off that revenue stream, but we survive on donations from readers and well-wishers. And yeah, it's now a modestly successful business.
There you go. Okay, after the longest intro ever, we've got to go back to the first question, which is how you grew up.
I initially grew up in London, and then at the age of 13, moved to Devon for 3 years. So my father had gone to a very unusual school, a very progressive school in the 1930s called Dartington Hall. It was one of the kind of first progressive schools in the world. It was set up by this eccentric couple, this American multi-millionairess called Dorothy and her husband Leonard, and it was inspired by the teachings of this Indian philosopher called Tagore, and it was inspired by wanting to create this kind of vibrant rural community in Devon with all these kind of trades and crafts and everything integrated, and this wonderful progressive school where kids were able to kind of learn at their own pace and discover their passion without having to do Latin, or games. And my father had a rich uncle who wanted him to inherit his sheep farm in Australia. And the only school in England which taught sheep farming was Dartington. And so my father, at the age of 13, ended up at this school. I think there were only like a dozen pupils at that time. And Dorothy Elmhurst was the headmistress, as well as being the kind of benefactor of the whole circus. And he was he had quite negligent bohemian parents, and they were separated. So his father was a conductor of community singing and the music editor of the Daily Express, so journalism's in the blood, and his mother was a member of the Communist Party and the Friends of the Soviet Union and an artist. But they were English as well. She was Irish and he was Australian. So my father was half Australian, half Irish. But these kind of slightly kind of flighty bohemian parents who didn't do a great job of looking after him. So he sort of became almost adopted, not formally but semi-adopted by Dorothy, and that was life changing because she was kind of immensely rich, and had all these kind of connections in the US. So he ended up, they would take him with, they would summer in Martha's Vineyard, and he would go with them to Martha's Vineyard on the QE1 or whatever it was, in a kind of luxury berth. And he ended up at one stage having dinner she was great friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, so he ended up having dinner at the White House with FDR and discussing, the New Deal when he was 16, and had this kind of, it was amazing opportunities opened up for him as a consequence, and he ended up becoming. He initially joined the Communist Party too, and then left and joined the Labour Party, and he became the sort of head of the Labour Party internal think tank during the Second World War, and helped draft the kind of legislative programme, helped devise the legislative programme which became the programme of the Attlee Labour government from 45 to 50. And at that time he was head of the Labour Research Department. So it was a great time to be in politics. And he had an extraordinarily influential role. He wrote the 1945 Labour Manifesto. Labour won a landslide, totally unexpectedly, because Churchill was the leader of the Conservative Party, and he just almost single-handedly won the Second World War. But nevertheless, the Attlee-led Labour Party won a landslide. So fantastic time to be in politics, to be alive. And but he then became a bit disillusioned with politics, and he sort of gradually kind of drifted to the right, though never further than kind of joining the SDP, which was a kind of forerunner of the current Lib Dems, and then went back to the Labour Party. So different politics to me, but he was a kind of he was a social entrepreneur. So he created lots of institutions and organisations. He set up a magazine, Which magazine, now very successful, like a consumer products magazine. And he was one of the people who helped create the Open University. He set up about 50 different University of the Third Age, about 50 different organisations and institutions. So that was in the blood too. So that's why, in addition to being a journalist, I've also tried to set things up as well. So set up the schools and set up the Free Speech Union, set up the Daily Sceptic, etc.
And so he sent you to the same school he went
No,
to?
he sent all his other children to the same school, but I was given the choice, and I said, no, I want to go. So when we moved to Devon, so yeah, sorry, that was a sort of long digression, but the reason we moved to Devon is so he could get access to the Elmhurst's papers, because he'd been tasked with writing a biography of the Elmhurst. So he was writing this book, and that's why he wanted to move to Devon. So we all moved as a family for 3 years, and he said, do you want to go to Dartington, to me and my sister? And she said yes, I said no, and all his other children had been there, and I went to the local comprehensive instead. So no, I failed all my O-levels, as GCSEs were then called, first time around, apart from one. So when I retook them, I did get some lessons at Dartington. So I was sort of, I went over there to get history lessons and maths lessons once a week, but I was never really at the school.
Huh. So you failed all your GCSEs, but then you ended up at Oxford?
Yeah, well, the story of how I got into Oxford has dogged me ever since I told it as a self-deprecating story, and was brought up, indeed, when I was appointed to the Office for Students. So I got in because I was sent an acceptance letter by mistake. So I got a letter just sort of addressed, "Dear candidate, you'll want to know where your parents should be dropping you off, what time you should get here, how to pick up your room key." And it wasn't addressed to me personally. It had been photocopied lots of times. The ink was kind of fading in places. But I thought, well, if they're sending me this letter, I must have got in. And I never thought I would, because, they'd made me this generous conditional offer of 3 Bs in my A-levels, and getting an O-level pass in French, because that was a matriculation requirement back then. And I thought, well, I'm never going to get an O-level in French, so I didn't even try. And I didn't get 3 Bs. I ended up getting 2 Bs and a C. I'd shown no academic promise at that stage at all, and applying to Oxford was wildly ambitious. My mother really discouraged me from doing so. She'll just lead to disappointment. But I got this acceptance letter, or a letter sent to successful candidates anyway, by mistake. And I thought, my God, they must have overlooked the fact that it didn't quite meet their very generous conditional offer. And my mother couldn't believe it, and my teachers fell off their chairs. And then a week later, I got the actual letter, the rejection letter, written by the admissions tutor. "Dear Toby, not only you failed to meet our A-level conditional offer, you didn't even attempt to get an O-level in French. Good luck in your university career elsewhere. Be gone." And my father, who knew the admissions tutor slightly, rang him up to find out. I didn't want him to do it. I was like, no. My father was like, well, we better ring up and find out which is the correct letter. And I said, it's perfectly, blindingly obvious which the correct letter is. The first one was obviously a mistake. The second letter is the correct letter. It's addressed to me personally. Let's not. It'll just be embarrassing. He insisted, it ain't over till the fat lady sings. He was unbelievably tenacious all his life, which is why he managed to create all these institutions. He had real dogged tenacity, determination. Anyway, so he called up Harry Judge, and Harry, so he explained what had happened, and Harry Judge said, well, which letter did he get first? And my father said, well, the one implying he'd got in. And he said, hang on, I've got the PPE tutors here. I'd applied to do philosophy, politics and economics. So they then had a conversation, like we could overhear it all, about whether, having sent me this acceptance letter by mistake, they had to kind of honour the implied promise. What if I turned down an offer from somewhere else on the basis of this letter I'd got from Oxford? And they kind of went round the houses with this for about 5-10 minutes. And then he came back on the phone and says, okay, he can come. And I've told that story a number of times, and now it's always brought up by my enemies as the only reason Toby got into Oxford is because his father pulled strings, because he knew the admissions tutor. But actually, I had lunch with Harry Judge about 25 years later. I said, did you decide to let me in because of your relationship with my father? And he said, no, absolutely not. We thought that you could sue us if we didn't let you in, because, you could have turned down an offer from somewhere else on false pretenses. So, yeah, we thought to protect ourselves, we'd better give you a place. So that was the reason. And, I could have been the son of a dustman. And if the same thing had happened, according to Harry anyway, I would have got in. Maybe he was protecting himself, didn't want me to think, or anyone else to think, that he was, acting because of his personal relationship with my father. They didn't know each other that well. But anyway, that's always been brought up since as an evidence of just... And everyone says, isn't it ironic? Because his father coined the word meritocracy. And my father wrote this book called The Rise of the Meritocracy. But it's not really that ironic, because my father was not a fan of meritocracy. He was a great critic of meritocracy, which isn't to say that he thought nepotism would have been a preferable mechanism for selecting, Oxford students. But nevertheless, it isn't a great irony. If you understand anything about the book or his critique of meritocracy, he wouldn't have minded that I got in on an unmeritocratic, completely accidental basis, because he didn't think meritocracy was up to much in the first place. But anyway, yeah.
And you obviously did well enough there to end up Fulbright scholar and go to Harvard and the Cambridge PhD and everything else. Yeah,
so I can, if I want, say to people who say, you only got into Oxford because of who your father is, I can say, yeah, but I got into Harvard and Cambridge on merit. But I don't ever say that because it sounds a bit too self-aggrandizing.
Right, so how did you come to form your values? In childhood, I guess, or what were you like? So obviously with the Times example, it's like you're a bit of a troublemaker, or it's fun for you to like mess around with authority or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always hard to know exactly, where one's kind of political values come from. Though I think most people have the same political values as their parents. I mean, I think statistically that's true. In my case, it isn't true. I don't think my values are, as different from my father's as some people think. He certainly cared a great deal and was very interested in education, and didn't set up any schools, but set up some universities, higher education institutions, and he cared about community, localism, wasn't a fan of kind of the big state, and was always a kind of small state, kind of socialist, believed in the kind of cooperative movement. So, I don't think we're as far apart as people often say, my God, if Lord Young was still alive, he'd be spinning in his grave.
Do people say that?
They do, yeah.
That's
which is
awful.
Yeah, pretty unpleasant, but I guess, if you're in the arena, you have to take it, as Teddy Roosevelt said. I was a punk when I was 13, so I remember, singing Anarchy for the UK in front of the mirror, playing along on my guitar.
Mohawk? Haircut?
Oh, well, I absolutely had a mohawk. I had a safety pin through my ear. I dyed my mohawk green at one point. I used to wear ripped jeans, a Destroy t-shirt, from Sedition on the King's Road. And I had an older sister who was quite into it too. So I was kind of like her little punk mascot younger brother, but I was completely into it. I remember going to buy Nevermind the Bollocks the day it came out and walking down the King's Road, with a bunch of other punks clutching our copies of the album and seeing some teddy boys on the other side of the street, and it got a bit kind of feisty. But so I was totally into punk, and it was the kind of ideal kind of pop subculture for rebellious adolescents. I mean, it was kind of anti-authority, it was anti-state, it was angry, it was energetic, it annoyed all the right people, and it had this great kind of DIY ethic. Anyone could be in a band, so I immediately set up dozens of bands, and I thought of myself as an anarchist then. And now I'm on the kind of libertarian wing of the Conservative Party, and I don't think that's too great a journey. And I'm always astonished when other people who describe themselves as anarchists go out and protest about, say, austerity or government cuts. It's like, why do you want the state to be even larger? Why do you want taxpayers to pay even more money? Why are you such a fan of the public sector if you're an anarchist? Surely you should be a libertarian conservative like me. So I don't think... Yeah, that I think my values, my political values, have as much to do with that moment in British popular culture, which really spoke to me as a kind of awkward, angry adolescent, as anything else I think that's happened in my life.
So before we get to, I want to talk about free speech, but I just want to ask, I have so many questions about all the things we talked about in the intro, but what was the hardest part of all those ups and downs psychologically?
Well, when I failed all my O-levels, I didn't fail. I got a C in English literature and a grade 1 in CSE drama, which was the equivalent of a C. You needed, so I had 2 Cs, but you needed 5 Cs to get into the sixth form, to do 3 A-levels and go to university. So I initially just dropped out. I remember calling up my mother and saying, "Mum, I don't think I'm academically bright," which is a kind of middle-class euphemism for thick as a plank. And so I thought I'd pursue a career in manual labour. Instead, I'll learn a trade. My mother was quite enthusiastic about that. I thought I'd be able to support myself, move out of home eventually, even if I didn't go to school anymore. And so I went on this work experience scheme. It's like a welfare to work program created by Margaret Thatcher's government. So I kind of worked in a garage, I worked in a kitchen, I worked as a cleaner. And after, 6 months or so of this, I thought, crikey, I'm no more cut out for this life than I am for academic life. And my father packed me off to Israel. So he had a friend in the kibbutz movement, so I went to a kibbutz in Israel. And I was a big pothead at that time. So, from the age of about 14, I'd been smoking, several joints a day, which is one reason why I'd never really engaged at school or been able to retain anything I was taught. Terrible thing to do, and I certainly wouldn't recommend it to anyone. But probably from the age of 13, really. From the moment I moved to Devon, I became a kind of absolute kind of pothead.
That didn't really go with the
saturated in
punk
marijuana smoke.
Movement, did it?
They went into speed and sniffing glue, but it was the nearest we could get to that in rural Devon, where most people grew it in their own gardens. Anyway, but in Israel, because the borders are so closely guarded, there was no marijuana, and so I kind of, I sobered up, as it were, and the kind of mist began to clear, and my brain was switched on, and I started getting really interested in Israeli politics and reading the Middle Eastern politics, reading the papers every day, arguing with everybody on the kibbutz, and had a kind of this sort of intellectual awakening in this kind of very dramatic kind of part of the world. I remember on one of the kibbutzes I was on, I had to go into an air raid shelter because it was, there were Katyusha missiles raining down on the kibbutz. So it was, a very kind of critical time in the history of Israel. It was around, I guess, 80, 81. And I thought to myself, well, actually, maybe I should go back to school. And it was that decided me to go back to school. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do that, I might as well aim high and see if I can get into Oxford, which was wildly ambitious at that point. So that was the kind of road to Damascus kind of moment when I thought, no, I don't want to be a labourer or acquire a manual skill. I want the life of the mind.
Wow. Very interesting path. But so did you find the stuff in New York, was that like being sacked or being cancelled? Like, what was the most difficult time for you?
Yeah, well, I think I think I taught because of that initial failure at the age of 16. I'd sort of, from an early age, taught myself how to kind of bounce back, how to treat a defeat as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a reason to give up. And so then when I, faced subsequent failures, I was able to, I guess, deal with them more easily. It was being in New York. The reason I was poached by Graydon Carter, then the editor of Vanity Fair, to come work for him in New York was because I started this magazine called The Modern Review in 91 with Julie Burchell and her then husband Cosmo Landesman, both English journalists. He's American actually originally, and it was kind of like it was intellectuals and academics writing long scholarly pieces about people like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Madonna. And we called it Low Culture for Highbrows. And it was in the kind of format of a kind of periodical, it looked like the London Review of Books, but it was all kind of about pop culture. And he kept it going for 4 years, and it was a kind of success d'estime. They're not really a commercial success, and most of our good writers were poached. And we discovered a lot of people, gave them their break, like Nick Hornby, I think, published his first ever piece, I think, in the Modern Review, went on to be a very successful novelist. Will Self, Tom Shone, a movie critic. So it was a kind of springboard for a lot of really talented writers and journalists. And it was lots of fun. And because Graydon admired it, when it went kind of belly up, when I fell out with Julie and burnt the whole thing to the ground, he summoned me to New York. And I thought that was opportunity knocking. I thought it'll only be a matter of time before I have the big apple in the palm of my hand. I'll follow in the footsteps of these other English journalists like Tina Brown, who've gone to New York and kind of made their fortune as magazine editors. I thought it won't be long before I'm editing a magazine. And Graydon Carter said, I'll introduce you to Cy Newhouse, then the owner of Condé Nast. And he sort of, he gave me the impression that, that he had me in mind to edit one of the magazines in the Condé Nast stable, but it never worked out. I was just a bad fit from the word go. Graydon once said to me, he said, I don't really understand you. You're like an Englishman born in New Jersey. So I think he expected me to kind of, all Englishmen to be like Hugh Grant and appear in tennis whites, swinging a tennis racket, and being full of oleaginous charm and kind of floppy hair and the rest of it. And I was like this, this kind of driven, kind of slightly obnoxious kind of goblin.
But you kind of just got on with
I managed to. So after I was expecting great things, those great things didn't materialise. My career just seemed to go downhill. So after 5 years, I came back to London, and then decided to turn my experience of being a glossy magazine editor in Manhattan into a comic memoir. And that was the kind of inception of How to Lose Friends and Alienate People. And that became a kind of international bestseller, which is why it got turned into a movie. So yeah, making lemonade from lemons is something I've been doing from a fairly early age.
Seems like you're pretty good at that, because that's kind of the free speech union thing as well. It's like, I've been cancelled and now I'm gonna create this thing. Yeah,
I'd say that was probably one of the low points of my life was losing 5 jobs in very quick succession. And in particular, I'd kind of pivoted towards education from journalism, and was beginning to think about I more or less had a full-time career in education, running this charity, helping parents, charities set up free schools. I was still doing a bit of journalism, still doing my Spectator column, but it wasn't how I earned my living anymore. And I could see a kind of career in education kind of mapped out before me. And I had lots of ideas about how to kind of build really good free schools like the secondary I'd set up, and like Michaela, how to kind of roll those out across the country and replicate at scale what we'd achieved with these schools, and thought that I'd kind of cracked the code. I'd come up with the magic sauce to really improve, particularly secondary education. And I still think that, yeah, I did, and so's Catherine. But not having the opportunity to kind of follow that map, that route, that was kind of really wrenching. And also just being publicly shamed is it strips you of your dignity. It's not a very pleasant experience. I lost about half a stone. I call it the public humiliation diet. And you kind of think that when I left my house at the absolute height of the kind of storm, I remember wearing this kind of trapper's cap because I was worried that if anyone recognized me, they might start attacking me in the street, that the Twitter mob would kind of spring to life and I'd be pursued, like the character in Apocalypto, that kind of Mel Gibson film. So yeah, that was quite tough for about 3 months. But I think, having talked to other people who've been through it now, lots and lots of people who've been through similar experiences, like kind of, through the Free Speech Union, but also just meeting people who've been through similar experiences, because we tend to kind of gravitate towards one another and form a kind of informal support group. Actually, I don't think I had it too badly, because what did for me wasn't a sex scandal. The people who find, being publicly shamed the hardest of all are people who are publicly shamed because they get involved in a sex scandal of some kind. Because
Hancock or something.
Yeah, because then their families are no longer a safe haven. They don't have the support of their wife. They're embarrassed in front of their children, and in my case, that wasn't true. So that made it easier to endure.
Was there anything that was brought up from during that time where you thought, actually, yeah, I shouldn't have said that, or were you like, everything, everything's kind of taken out of context, or it was?
No, there were lots of things. There were quite a few things I regretted having said, particularly on Twitter. I didn't really regret provocative articles I'd written in the Spectator, and it just felt very unfair that people were taking everything out of context and reading it in the most uncharitable way in order to kind of furnish themselves with a stick to beat me with. You had this powerful sense of injustice, but one of the hallmarks of people who get cancelled often is that they think to themselves, I've always observed the social contract. I've always been a decent person. I've never really done anything particularly awful. I've always tried to be a good, upstanding member of my community, a decent citizen. So why is this happening to me? It's kind of puzzling at some kind of visceral, elemental level. And often people conclude, well, I must have done something wrong. Because you can't kind of give up the just world fallacy, the illusion that we live in a just universe. Even if you think of yourself as a kind of godless heathen, you still retain some attachment to this idea that there is some kind of karmic justice in the universe, and bad things don't happen to good people. So if something bad's happening to you, you cannot help but think, maybe I did something to deserve it. And that leads to a lot of kind of dark nights of the soul, and we have to tell people who believe that of themselves, who are going through being cancelled, who have been cancelled. I have to tell them again and again, no, you didn't do anything wrong. It's not because you're a bad person. You are the victim of an injustice. But it's hard to persuade people of that. But so that was, and of course I sort of audited all these things I'd said on Twitter and thought, God, I shouldn't have said that. One example, it's pretty sordid, but during Red Nose Day in 2009, which is this kind of telethon on the BBC where they try and raise money for third world charities, developing world charities. A woman had tweeted after a segment showing kind of starving kids in an African country, oh my God, that was so unbelievably traumatic. I just got through an entire box of Kleenex. And I responded below her, me too, haven't wanked so much in ages. Which was a stupid throwaway remark to make. I was trying to kind of, point out that she was sort of virtue signalling, talking about how moved she'd been and how she was crying. It seemed like I was I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to try and advertise that I'm callous to make you look like a kind of virtue signalling prig. And that was resurrected when I was appointed to the Office for Students, and that made the front page of the Mail on Sunday. Theresa May's universities are in sordid remark about Red Nose Day, and when I learned that was going to be on the front page of the Mail on Sunday, I was fighting this campaign, trying to survive. When you're cancelled on this scale, you're watching your career burn to the ground, and you just have no idea how to put out the fire. And I thought, well, this is it. When the Mail on Sunday, Britain's biggest selling newspaper, puts this story on the front page and people read it, and no one's going to think it was a joke or I had any kind of purpose for tweeting. They're just going to think I'm the kind of horrible, creepy guy who finds images of starving children in Africa sexually arousing.
What?
It was, and that was the implication. That was the that was the uncharitable reading of my tweet. And I thought I remember being in my garden shed where I kind of do most of my work, thinking, oh my God, this is how I'm going to be remembered. My grandchildren, this is the only thing they're going to know about me, that I said this idiotic thing on Twitter in 2009. That's the only thing I'll be remembered for. And that was a kind of moment of despair. But actually, what a lot of people said to me at the time is true. When you are engulfed in one of these storms, you think, the entire world knows about it, and you're being shamed in the eyes of the entire world, and they'll never forget these terrible things they've learnt about you. But a lot of people said to me at the time was, it'll be fish and chip paper tomorrow. No one's going to remember this in a week's time, let alone a year's time. Don't worry about it. And that actually is that's much truer than my kind of catastrophizing kind of perception of what was happening at the time.
How did it go down at the time? Did you just kind of get something out of being that outrageous? Or because for me that is it's clearly a joke, but I'm just like, this is gross. There's a lot of comedians where I'm just like, this is gross. I don't want to listen to this. But
that kind of gross out humour, which was deliberately offensive in the most tasteless way, was kind of on trend then. I mean, that's not really an excuse, and I certainly wouldn't say it again today. But
so did you feel good about? You were like, oh yeah, I'm getting cheered on for this,
Well, at the time,
yeah.
I didn't even think I didn't really notice.
Or that was kind of your thing. You would make lots of jokes like that on Twitter.
Well, I guess I've always been. I always bridle slightly when people virtue signal, when people try and advertise just what a good person they are, just how compassionate they are, just how much they care about the vulnerable and the needy and the weak. That's always kind of slightly got my goat. And my reaction to that is to do the opposite and to kind of vice signal rather than virtue signal. And that was most of the things which got me into the most trouble. Like that tweet were examples of that. It was a kind of impulsive reaction to acts of virtue signaling, whereas I would try and make it look silly by vice signaling in response. But yeah, if you want a career in public life, it's not a good idea to do that.
But I guess you can see, because even I started reading your book, and you say some comment about if Sylvester Stallone walked in, you would get down on your knees or something. And that, to me, I'm just like, okay, this is gross. This is not my style of humor. But you can straight away see, okay, this is the type, like Jimmy Carr or something. It's like, this is someone who makes these type of jokes that are probably appeal to men more than women, and.
I remember showing How to Lose Friends and Alienate People, the film. It was at a Christmas party or something, and it was at the New Schools Network, the charity I was running at the time, and the CFO thought it would be quite fun to show all the staff members this film, to they get a kind of better understanding of me and where I was coming from and what I'd done before I'd got into education. And I remember watching it with all these young women, mostly left-wing young women in their 20s, and just cringing and thinking, oh God, this is going to be going down really, really badly. Showing this film was a really bad idea. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it is a kind of sophomoric male humour which doesn't play. It played okay then, but it plays really badly now.
So why do you feel you shouldn't have apologised?
Well, no, actually, the advice the Free Speech Union gives to people is that don't apologise if you think it'll make things better, because it almost certainly won't, and it could very easily make things worse.
Is that's like a Winston Marshall thing, kind of how he apologised just to kind of calm things down, and then he's like, actually, why did I apologise?
Yeah. So, but if you feel genuinely contrite, if you do regret some of the things you're being accused of, then I think it can be appropriate to apologise. And I guess I did regret some of the things that I'd said. But I also thought that if I apologise and step down from the Office for Students, it'll all go away. And that was hopelessly naive.
So why Can we we've already done an hour, but we haven't even started talking about free speech. So I just want to ask you, because a lot of people look at this now, free speech is being labelled as this like right-wing thing, and it's about it's about saying offensive things, and it's about, I love your thing, male, pale and stale. Like, it's just about protecting these like old white men. But is that true? Or is there, if someone was then, lost their job for saying that they think 3 people should get married, or something, like some super woke thing, or, I think the obvious one is like what's going on in Iran, or with Russia and the...
Yeah. Well, an even better example is the way in which gender-critical feminists who challenge the kind of trans rights dogma have been cancelled. So, like, I'd say about a third of the cries for help we get now at the Free Speech Union are from middle-aged women who've got into trouble for defending women's rights as they see it. So it isn't just male, pale and stale people who are being cancelled these days. It's actually more likely to be female and neither pale or stale. I think, it is odd, as you say. Free speech used to be a liberal cause and was something the left historically valued more than the right. And then something changed. And I think it partly reflects the cultural ascendance of the left. Now that they are the establishment culturally, they no longer have a vested interest in defending free speech. When they were anti-establishment, when they were countercultural, then of course they wanted to defend their right to criticise the powers that be, the status quo, the nuclear family. But now that they are the new church, they're not nearly as keen on free speech, and it's become the right that have become keener on it, because they are now, culturally at least, countercultural. One of the hardest tasks, the Free Speech Union is a non-partisan organisation, and one of the hardest things I've found is persuading people on the left, particularly young people, that they should care as much about free speech as people on the right. That, things may be going their way now, but that isn't a reason to throw out free speech, because the wind can change, and then you're going to need these protections just as much as conservatives need them now. There was a great line, actually, from Ira Glasser, who was head of the ACLU when it won all those First Amendment victories in the 60s and 70s. He said that taking free speech away from your opponents can seem like a great idea, but it's like releasing poison gas on the battlefield. At any moment, the wind can change and the gas can blow back in your face. So I spend a lot of time talking to young people, not particularly friendly young people, students at places like Cambridge, trying to persuade them that actually they should care about free speech. It should matter to them. And, not just because they may need to stand up, or someone to stand up for their speech rights one day, but also because, it's important for people to be able to speak their minds, express themselves. And free speech isn't just about the right to say politically contentious, provocative things. It's also about the right to express yourself artistically, creatively. That's sometimes an argument that lands a bit better. But it's about being fully human. And it's also a kind of, it's the most important human right of all, because without free speech we can't defend any of our other rights. And in societies where democracy dies, the first thing to go is the right to free speech, because tyrants don't want their opponents to be able to criticise them in the public square, and they want to be able to get away with all the appalling things they're doing. So I'm constantly out there making the argument, but the hardest group to persuade are kind of the young woke left. But I think we're making some headway.
Yeah, I love Ira Glasser. He explains it so well. He does an interview on Joe Rogan, and he just explains it so well, because it's like, who gets to decide you can't have a group of people controlling what can be said, because that group of people, yeah, it's like the thing with the left, okay, you like what they're saying now, but they could change and suddenly they're coming after you. And yeah, I guess that's your point with the...
Yeah, and what's so surprising about the left's indifference to the assault on free speech is that often it's fueled by, paid for by states that they're not particularly sympathetic to. So it's been called the censorship industrial project by the people who did the Twitter files, Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberg, and they've exposed all these NGOs, state agencies, all funded ultimately by the US state and by kind of big foundations like the Soros Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which are energetically, actively trying to shut down dissent on Twitter and Facebook, even in the mainstream media, trying to demonetize, trying to disrupt the advertising and revenue models of dissident websites. And you'd think that the fact that it's funded by the US Defense Department would give them pause for thought. Should we really be supporting an effort to suppress so-called misinformation and disinformation that's really been initiated and is being funded by the US Defense Department, even if we think that the people who are going to suffer are more likely to be right of centre than people like us? I mean, you'd think that would wake them up to there's something pretty sinister going on here. But so far it hasn't. I mean, the Twitter files got a huge amount of play in my world, but in the mainstream liberal media, almost totally ignored.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It's also a values thing, I guess, because
Well, it's become a culture war issue, hasn't it? So if Trump stands up for free speech, then people who don't like Trump think it's tainted. There's something toxic about it. I won't defend it because the other side are defending it. It's become weaponized in the culture war, which is regrettable.
Yeah. Ira Glasser is so interesting because he's Jewish and he talks about having to go in to defend protests of like people who want to have like a neo-Nazi protest, which when you listen to how he explains it, and especially when you think of everything that's happened in history, particularly for Jewish people, and it's like how, like it kind of I feel like people just have to look at history and the damage the power of the state can do to people. I mean, you only have to look at what's going on now. Like people in Russia don't have the full information about the war. Like, women in Iran, it's like risking that. I had someone on this podcast talking about what's going on in Iran, but he's like so worried that now he won't be able to go there because they have facial ID and like, seeing that you've protested and now you're not allowed back in to see your relatives. It's like, this is why it's important you should be free to say like, I don't think war's a good thing, or I don't think oppressing people is a good thing.
And also a lot of the really sinister ways of controlling what people say that have emerged in China are now being rolled out across democracies. We're seeing the emergence of a social credit system. I mean, last year, actually, no, I think it was earlier this year. No, it was last year. PayPal closed the account of the Free Speech Union without really giving a proper explanation. And that's one example amongst thousands of people who dissent, or even people who defend the right to dissent, are being demonetized, deplatformed by big payment processing companies, big financial services companies, and people don't seem nearly as concerned about it as they should be. But one example I love about the harm that the suppression of free speech can cause is that in Wuhan, at the end of 2019, when a group of doctors discovered that there was this new, extremely infectious viral form of pneumonia that was, seemingly had emerged in Wuhan in the last couple of weeks, they immediately tried to raise the alarm and they were arrested by the Chinese authorities for antisocial behaviour and imprisoned. And had they been allowed to express their concerns about this, tell the world about this new virus, then in all likelihood it would never have escaped from Wuhan. But because the Chinese authorities shut these guys up and punished them for raising the alarm and said they were lying, it was able to spread way beyond Wuhan to the rest of the world and kill tens of millions of people.
But yeah, that's what I meant by the values point, because when I was at Cambridge, I asked some of my Chinese classmates what they thought about, because everyone's saying like, oh my god, in China it's so bad, this is going on, and everything with the Uyghur people and whatever. And so I asked them what they think about it. And yeah, one of my classmates said he was like, it's not that, you can't access all this, you can't get the information. He was like, it's not that big deal, you can use a VPN, but also it's actually a good thing that the people don't get all the information, because when people have information it can cause uprisings and it can cause disruptions, and protests and things are disruptive to productivity. And I think there are people who believe that as well. Like I know, my friend who think, no, well, we shouldn't have all the information about COVID, or sometimes we just need propaganda so that everyone agrees, so to keep us safe. Like some people like safety is such a value to them that they're like,
well, that was the real eye-opener during the lockdowns. I expected the British people to resist the attempt to kind of lock them in their homes and be outraged that they were being told you can only spend an hour outside your home. You can't go to parks and see your friends. I didn't think that would sit well with, the British people, who are legendarily kind of, these rugged, individualistic, ornery defenders of their liberty. Turned out most people loved it, because it made them feel safe. And they prized safety way above their liberty. I mean, I think even the government didn't think they could get away with it. And to their astonishment, the British population turned out to be incredibly compliant by and large. And you kind of think, I told myself until then, in this kind of, patriotic, tub-thumping way, Nazism could never have happened here. We never would have stood for it. We wouldn't have allowed it to happen. We wouldn't have complied. We would have resisted. But actually, seeing what happened during the lockdown, I think it could have happened here.
Yeah, but here was nothing compared to Australia.
Yeah, that was even more shocking. I'd always thought of Australians as, as these kind of proud, yeoman-like defenders of their liberties. Turned out they were even more compliant than us. I think Clive James once made the gag that you think Australia's a nation descended from convicts. Actually, it's a nation descended from prison wardens.
Yeah.
But that seemed to kind of, that was the only explanation I could think of at the time for why. But actually, it wasn't just Australia. It was worse in certainly in some parts of Australia even than here, but also across America too. I mean, where was the love of liberty? If the whole thing, I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I think the whole thing was just a cock-up, but if it was in fact designed by the Chinese Communist Party to kind of stress test how much we valued liberty, it's been an incredibly successful experiment. Who's going to die to defend our liberties if what we really want is just to feel safe? We're going to welcome the Chinese stormtroopers with open arms.
Okay. Anything else to wrap up? Or shall I ask you the last 3 questions?
Now, ask me the last 3 questions.
Okay. Is there a book that's had a big impact on your life?
Yeah. I remember. I mean, I was really taken with 2 books at Harvard. One was and this was in 1987, and they were released in quite quick succession, quite close to each other. One was The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, which was a kind of conservative critique of kind of secular humanism in the West, as it then was, and of kind of political correctness, woke 1.0. Very good book, very foresightful, prescient. And he was a pupil of a political philosopher called Leo Strauss at the University of Chicago, and I then became very interested in Leo Strauss and wrote about him at Harvard and subsequently my PhD. That was a very influential book. But another book I read at the same time was Cultural Literacy by E.D. Hirsch, talking about how important it is for children to be given a kind of storehouse of common knowledge at schools, that is the kind of bedrock of a culture, of a nation state. It's teaching children the same core facts about their history, their geography, their culture. And so that made a big impact on me, but it didn't really come out until I got into education about, 30 years later.
How do you stay grounded?
I've got 4 teenage kids, so it's not difficult.
What about during that really difficult period?
I think one thing that there was a comedian who got cancelled. Oh God, what was he called? He got cancelled for exposing himself to female comedians. He was. Oh, his name will come to me in a second. But he has this bit. He now does a kind of set about being cancelled. Very funny. But he has a line in that set saying that they say that when something like this happens to you, you find out who your real friends are. And I found out who my real friends are, but it was the wrong half. And so all the kind of high status rich friends, they all scarpered. And the only ones left were the old kind of college buddies that he'd been avoiding for 20 years. But in my case, it wasn't the wrong half. It was, most of them. And that made it a lot easier to endure.
And what 3 words describe the best version of you?
Funny, brave, thoughtful.
Amazing. Thanks for coming on.
I'll have amazing too.